Accountants with guns. These are the special agents of the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. There's 2,000 of them, and they have not only plenty of firepower, but they're also armed with the sole mandate across the U.S. government to investigate violations of federal tax laws and related crimes. For more than a century, CI special agents have worked quietly across 21 field offices and 11 foreign countries on investigations of massive scale and complexity, seizing billions of dollars in assets. Hello, everyone. This is Techtopia. I'm Chitra Ragavan. Criminal investigation has played an outsized role in some of the biggest, most fascinating criminal tax cases of our time, from taking down legendary bootlegger Al Capone and investigating the Lindbergh Baby kidnapping to bringing the hammer down on Russian President Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs for sanctions violations via the recently launched Justice Department Task Force, Kleptocracy. I'm delighted to have as my guest today James Robnett, Deputy Chief of IRS Criminal Investigation, to tell us more about the amazing work that he and his team are doing. Jim, welcome to Techtopia.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chitra. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you began your career in the IRS.
Well, I'm an accountant by trade, schooled in that specialty, worked in public accounting for a short period of time, then started with the IRS as a field auditor, went out and audited businesses and small companies. And I did a little bit of work. I found myself involved in identifying some fraud cases. And as I did that, I worked really close with a unit that I knew very little about that was part of IRS. It's the Criminal Investigation Division, called at that time. And as I worked with those agents on the fraud that I identified, I became interested in becoming a special agent. And so from that point, around 1994, I was selected as a special agent, went to training, and part of that training is the law enforcement side. It's an unusual combination, right? With accountants, with lots of firepower, as you described us. We go to federal law enforcement training for 6 months, like every other federal law enforcement agency that most people might recognize, like the Bureau or HSI, ATF, and so on. So we're all schooled in those fine arts of law enforcement. And then we each go to our specialty, the things that we're charged with protecting. In our case, it's financial crime from every corner, every type, with an emphasis on investigating allegations of criminal tax fraud.
So was it always the case that they were hiring people with accounting backgrounds and then also giving them guns, or did that evolve over time?
Well, you know what's interesting, and you mentioned about our 100-year history. The first agents that were brought in to build this division were actually postal inspectors, about 5 to 6 of them, because at that time there was a lot of corruption, a lot of tax evasion by large companies, and in this case, not as many companies as there were gangsters. And the government realized they needed an accounting mind with some sort of law enforcement experience. And that's how we started. And ever since that day, when there were probably less than 10 of us, those two components, the accounting and finance component plus the law enforcement training, really resonated, so that the crimes that are committed under various statutes, usually by criminals who are driven by greed and power, almost always result in money. That is the sole purpose for most criminal activity. And so we follow money. And so that degree in accounting and that degree in finance and that experience goes a long way to us asking the questions, the agents asking the right questions to follow the money. And that's what we do best, better than anyone.
And you've now spent, nearly 4 decades at the IRS and nearly, 30 years of those in criminal investigation. What drew you to the work and has kept you there all these years?
Well, Chitra, I think I aged about 10 years when you said that. So thanks for that. But I'll tell you, I think I know the reason I've stayed here because I am dedicated to the mission. The agents and our investigative teams here at IRS CI, we're dedicated to protecting those dollars in the Treasury, because we, like everyone else, we pay our taxes. We want to make sure they go toward the right things. And for me to be part of an organization where for 10 years, I did investigations, and now I can actually help direct resources to agents in our investigative teams in a way that I've learned to best point toward the criminal activity. That's what's kept me here. It's a great group of people, very dedicated public servants. It's not a job. It is a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that I like. It's a lifestyle that everyone here in this agency has made sacrifices for, but we do it because we're public servants at heart. We're dedicated, and I like serving the people here, and that's why I'm still here.
And, having covered law enforcement for many, many years, I know that it's law enforcement agents, really, there's the credit sometimes often keeps you going because there's very little in other incentives like pay and all of that
True.
stuff. But
Right.
But I think your division often does a lot of really fascinating work, but kind of sometimes doesn't get the kind of credit or is not seeking the kind of credit it deserves on these cases.
Well, and you're right, and we really don't do it for the credit. Of course, everyone likes to be recognized. I like the agents to be recognized for the hard work that they do. This is not a 9-to-5 job. Criminals, they work all hours of the day and night. Unlike you and I, Chitra, that's their job. And and so, we don't wake up at 8 o'clock and say, we're just going to, chugging 8 hours today or 9 hours today. One day maybe 10 hours, the other day maybe 12, another one maybe 8. It just depends. And so that work is done very methodically. And the satisfaction we have in this job with what we're charged to do in financial investigations, criminal financial investigations, that what we don't have to rely on as much as maybe some other work is that we have witnesses that tell us somebody said something bad, or they have they may tell us that there's a certain amount of money in the bank. But when we go seize that evidence and we obtain it from a bank, we have all kinds of legal processes we go through, and it takes time. We seize it, we build this case, and we have to, we investigate these allegations, right? And if the allegations are false, we move on to something else. And we do our best to look at and identify the most egregious criminal activity. And I think we're pretty good at doing that. But once we build a case, and we're taught to do this both through experience and in our training, it's airtight. The allegations we look at, these are not mistakes that someone makes. We're not tax collectors in this division. We're not auditors in this division. We look for a pattern of bad behavior that's obviously filled with bad money or evasion toward their tax liability. And we look for the nominee accounts, the hidden accounts, the attempts to thwart the tax law, abuse it, and so on. And so going back to your question, do we work in relative silence? We do. We build strong cases, cases that are, I would say, airtight. We have a 92% conviction rate. That's the highest in federal law enforcement. Now, do we turn as many cases as other law enforcement agencies? No, because one, we don't have as many agents, and two, it takes a little longer to work on cases. But that satisfaction of working these kind of cases on people who are stealing the taxpayers' dollars or are victimizing citizens because of, say, a Ponzi scheme or some schemes that we'll talk about here in a bit, there is a lot of satisfaction in a job well done, and that's how we work in silence, often with really no worry about recognition. But I will tell you, if we don't publicize and we don't let people know, the public know what we're doing, we're falling down. And we do have a really good communications division that takes care of that for us and lets the public know that we're working for them and we're doing our best.
Yeah. And, criminal investigation has such a sort of a dramatic and sweeping narrative arc. And let's start with like the bootlegging days of Al Capone and like all the way to today with cryptocurrency and sanctions. So let's tell some stories, starting with Al Capone. Obviously, that was like one of the most famous tax cases of all, right? It's only when the federal government realized that they could go after him using tax evasion and tax crimes that they were able to nab him.
Right, Chitra. And I hope that the people listening to your podcast remember that name. and I don't feel older when they say, "Who is that?" But that is that is the case that put us on the map. And if anyone out there has seen the movies that go to the Untouchables, and Kevin Costner plays Elliot Ness, I mean, there's threads of truth in that movie. He plays an ATF agent. The fact is that part, and Elliot Ness did his job at the time, but he was not the one that brought down Al Capone. It was these guys that were from the Postal Inspection Service, brought in to what then was to be known the intelligence unit of IRS CI at that time. And there was 6 guys. And the chief's name was Elmer Irie, and he was a postal inspector that had actually done a lot of internal investigative work within the Postal Service. And at that time, you might remember, or you don't remember, I don't remember, a lot of work in commerce was done through the mail. That's all it was. So the Postal Service was the they were the investigators at the time. So 5 or 6 of them came over in the IRS because at that time the president said, we have to fund a war. It's called World War I. And we know the tax law that was enacted in 1913, the income tax law, it's being abused. It's not being paid by the businesses and these corrupt gangsters. And the only people paying it are the ones, the people who really can't pay. And so the president charged the then commissioner of IRS to bring an investigative unit together. All that turned into these group of untouchables. And the real untouchables is Elmer Irie, Mike Malone, and a few others that you might remember from that movie, where they actually looked at Capone from how much money are you making and are you paying taxes on it? And what they found is that Mike Malone was the first undercover agent, actually went undercover into Capone's organization, became one of his right-hand man, lived with Capone for 3 years, lived in that organization for 3 years. He's the first undercover agent that should be spotlighted. This guy should have a statue for him. And so long story short is that they accounted for all of Capone's income over a several year period of time and realized he didn't pay any taxes on it. And that took a lot of time. And as a result, at trial, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced and placed in jail. Now, I'll tell you that Mike Malone, an interesting backstory, he knew of a scheme to scare some of the jury. And Al Capone's one of his bodyguards had a firearm that he was taking into court. And it was only then that Mike Malone exposed himself as a government employee, right? And where he took down that bodyguard to take the firearm from as that trial was ongoing. So really interesting story around that. So Capone was convicted and sent to jail on tax charges, not bootlegging, not anything else. He had been responsible for a lot of murders, a lot of violent activity. For a while, he had sort of this public sentiment that he was good, but once the corruption started, once the killing started, he lost that public sentiment, and the public asked, that this guy needs to be put in jail. And that the then intelligence unit, led by Elmer Irie, were the ones that put him away.
Yeah, despite all the liberties they took, The Untouchables is absolutely probably one of my most favorite movies, if not the most favorite movie. I watch it every single time I see it. It's advertised.
It is a great movie, and there's some characters in there that are real. I remember Frank Wilson. You might remember. I can't remember who played his part, but he was a guy who had like these round glasses, and they portrayed him as this this accountant. And all he could do was lose books. Well, he was real, and what's really interesting about Frank Wilson, he was on this team with Elmer Irie and Mike Malone, and Frank Wilson later went to lead the then formed United States Secret Service.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great story.
Well, that's one of the reasons that the Secret Service has that they're charged with identifying counterfeiting, and that's it's one of their primary missions, other than protection, obviously. But yeah, he went to go lead that agency after he left the intelligence unit.
And then shortly after was the other really famous case of the Lindbergh Baby kidnapping. How did CI get involved, and what was really notable about that investigation?
Yeah, interesting story. Again, how much your audience knows about Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh Sr., I know he was an aviator, one of the first to make the transatlantic flight. And so he was famous around a lot of, around that 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 record, and then a lot of others. But his child, Charles Lindbergh Jr., was kidnapped and held for ransom. And this was shortly after, it was in 1932, it was shortly after Capone's, trial and went to jail. And so the baby was kidnapped, and there was a ransom note left that, you pay $50,000, you'll find your child in a boat near the shore. They lived near the shore. And you'll leave your $50,000 in this location. And so Lindbergh had known about, had listened to the Capone trial, and said, hey, these guys at the intelligence unit, along with other law enforcement that they were talking to, these guys know what they're doing. If anyone can find this child, solve this crime, they're a good choice. So he went to the president, and at that time, and also went to Elmer Irie and said, hey, I need your help. So he engaged the intelligence unit to try to track down the criminal. Now, what's interesting is that and originally the government did not want Lindbergh to pay the ransom, but he insisted. He looked, his child was kidnapped out of a bedroom window, so he paid a $50,000 in ransom. Now, before he did that, though, and this is the brainchild of Elmer Irie and his unit, they said, we'll let you pay that. We'll pay it under one condition. We're going to record every serial number on every bill that you can give. And it was a bit of a fight, a bit of a struggle, I understand, but they did. It took like 14 to 15 clerks, just 8 hours a day recording all those numbers. They said, we're also going to place this money, in a certain container, so that perhaps one day when we find it or find something around it, it'll lead us to the person that's responsible for the crime. And during this time, it was this kidnapping, crime of the century, a lot of publicity around it. During this time, Capone was in prison. And Capone from prison said, hey, if I'm released, I can track down the kidnapper. Can you believe that?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What an intersection.
Right. And there could be really some real time, this is a truth is better than fiction example, right? That
Totally.
Capone from prison says he can do that. So during this time, Elmer Irie actually accompanies Lindbergh in what is probably a small plane at the time, flying over some of these marina areas where allegedly Lindbergh's child was kept, was being hidden. And so Elmer Irie's in plane or flying around. And so, because that's what the ransom note said. It said, hey, you'll find your child in a boat in this location. And so they paid the ransom. They couldn't find the child. But the intelligence unit there, along with local law enforcement, handed out pamphlets in the area there that had the serial numbers of these bills. And they said, hey, they handed them out to the banks. And they did that for a couple of years. And Frank Wilson made visits to the banks and said, hey, have you seen any of these C notes? And of course, the answers were no at the time. But about 30 or 20, 30 months after the baby was kidnapped, a gas station attendant, and these notes were actually $10 bills. They called them gold certificates at the time. Picked up a $10 bill from someone who gassed up at his New York gas station. And to protect him counterfeiting, he was looking at the bill, and he noticed something unusual about the guy that was paying it. And he wrote the serial number, not serial number, the license plate number of the car on the $10 gold certificate. Of course, that goes to the bank. The bank teller looks at that bill and realizes that that's one of the bills listed by those tellers,
Wow.
2 years earlier, right? That's sort of the needle in the haystack jumping out at you, I guess. And so that note with that license plate led them to a person named Bruno Hutman. And the police, had enough evidence to run a warrant on Bruno Hutman's house. And when they went in the house, they found a wooden box containing, at that time, 14,000 and change of bills. All those bills matched the list. What was really interesting about the box is that box was made from several different kinds of wood. And they found pieces of that around that house. After that warrant and prior to trial, the intelligence unit built the case against Bruno Hutman, because this is an important case. What they found out later in the midst of this is that Charles Jr. had been killed. He had been murdered shortly after he was kidnapped. They found him a short period of time, deceased, not far from the house. So Bruno Hauptmann's going in for murder. You have to got to tie him to the money and the kidnapping. And so the intelligence unit of the $50,000, they accounted for $49,800 and change. That's where that's following the money, right? I mean, that's in its infancy, how we follow the money.
Definitely good with money if you're able to come that close.
That's right. I mean, I don't do that well with my money in my bank account. I just hope it stays there. But some of the evidence, and this is really the cool part about the trial, and this is where evidence matters. It isn't about people saying they saw something. At trial, they entered a receipt for a boat trip that Hauptmann took with his wife to California. Now, what's interesting, on the receipt, the word boat was spelled B-O-A-D. On the ransom note, the word boat was spelled B-O-A-D. Connection, right there. At the very end of the trial, he was convicted. The trial foreman said that one of the things that contributed most to the conviction of Hauptmann was the fact that the cash was found in the house. The box was there, parts of the box was there, and that all that evidence tied 60 different ways went right to Hauptmann. So just, there's a murder solved by money, people who follow money. Now, we weren't the only one involved in that. The Bureau was involved in tracking some things down. Local law enforcement did as well. But that just, the plan itself was set in motion by the intelligence unit.
So from there, what would you say was the next big case and an area of new expertise? Would it be money laundering?
Well, money laundering came later. What I'll tell you is that after Capone was put in jail and in the midst of the Lindbergh investigation, there were Capones in every city. And it was well known by that time that if you, in Chicago, for example, where Capone was from, there were, stories of gangsters literally going to the IRS office and paying their tax. There was lines of them. Now, that doesn't mean they were all Capone-like. That's just the story. Every city had their Capone. And so from the Capone time on through for the next decade, IRS and the intelligence unit at that time continued to track the money and put those gangsters in jail, or at least push them to another type of crime, or maybe another law enforcement agency could get traction on it. Then I would say in the 40s, that was sort of the 20s and 30s. And in the 40s, we saw the emergence of mafia, right? Same kind of thing. And so there's the number of mafia family heads were tagged by IRS Criminal Investigation at the time. I'm not sure if it wasn't an intel unit, but it was it could have been intelligence unit. I think we're intelligence up through the 50s. And then shortly after that, we're moving into the 70s and 80s where we do get into the money laundering. We also get into John Gotti, Studio 54, and then the drug lords that come and begin to move their money, from their probably unstable parts of the world where they're manufacturing narcotics through the U.S. financial system. And that's when the late 70s or early 80s, where IRS CI saw this money move. And again, we're just following money, following value. And we see that money tied to criminal activity. And it was around that time, maybe the early 80s, that some of the first money laundering criminal statutes were put into play and enacted by Congress.
And in terms of technology, I mean, we talked about how with the Lindbergh Baby, it's the painstaking noting down of serial numbers, and then you're kind of the CI is becoming more sophisticated as these criminals are becoming more sophisticated, and you're handling different types of crimes. Was there any shift in terms of technology to combat these drug cartels or the mafia, et cetera?
I'd like to say that we're so technologically advanced that we're ahead of everyone, but we're not. I know that our expertise grows with the fact that we really haven't changed the mold in which our agents work. we are accountants or people with finance degrees. We ask the kind of questions that most people don't about someone's books and records. When we see a bank account, we just don't look at the bank balance. We say, wow, where did that deposit come from? Or where did that expenditure go to? And why is that expenditure coming out of this account? And so we just, we evolve with the crime. Technology wise, we began using computers and databases about the same time everyone else did. I'll tell you my age, that I was in the ranks of some of the first agents that when we had laptop computers used in field, and they weren't very powerful. That was probably in the early 90s. But in terms of what we do have access to, we work real well with our other counterparts, our other federal law enforcement. So we combine our skill sets when we need to. If there's an allegation around drug sales, narcotics, trafficking, I'm not talking at the street level, although it is where it spills out. But we're looking sort of in that middle to upper management of those organizations, because that's what they are. They're criminal organizations, businesses. And once we see an allegation of criminal activity that goes to selling something illegal, it says drugs, it could be other illegal activity that we and most of your audience has heard about. Any kind of proceeds that's earned from that and then moved and then attempted to be hidden, falls into our money laundering statute. And we work real closely with, and going back to your question, what changed? I think what changed is we began working real closely with our partner, federal law enforcement and local law enforcement agencies, because each of us bring a certain skill set to the table, and criminal activity is very diverse. You'll rarely find someone who just does one thing. It's always about how can I make money, 13 different ways. And so our strength is in our multi-agency cooperation, and in that we'll have access to more data and just more information resources.
So are there any cases in that era that really come to mind that you would like to highlight?
Well, I'll start with just sort of fast forward and to get your audience into, close to the century. In the 90s and the 2000s, what your audience may not know is that we actually were some of the first law enforcement on the ground during Operation Desert Storm. We actually tracked the money from Saddam Hussein's regime. At the time, he had stored a lot of money in different parts of the country. So we had a couple agents on the ground there that worked with special forces, and as they went out, we went out with them. And granted, these agents that work for us, they also have military backgrounds in some cases. We have a lot of other business skill sets of agents that come to us, and so they're on the ground asking the questions out in the public with the forces of where the money is. And so I would say, in the 90s, we helped track down millions and millions of dollars that was hidden by Saddam Hussein. We also worked with, and getting us into the 2000s, worked hand in hand in FBI's joint terrorism task forces, because again, that's where you need a multi-agency approach. And we worked really hard and long hours to help identify where the money that went to fund activity by Osama bin Laden. And so we worked on a team to help identify him. And then just to throw one other out that you may not be aware of, the Boston Marathon bombers. We have a large field office up there, worked real closely with the FBI, local law enforcement, to help investigate who those people were, how they got funded, who may have been involved in that as well. So a lot of interesting work throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s as we began to get involved in more illegal detecting, identifying, tracing illegal proceeds to the source to determine, what the crime was. You don't always know in the beginning, but you surely know as you traverse through the paper and the witnesses and the bank accounts and so on.
Yeah, and speaking of paper, right? We read a lot of those amazing stories of Bin Laden and his people, members of Al Qaeda, who were, when you found all of this pocket litter and found his notebooks and his diaries, and you found how, they were painstakingly keeping records of the most minute expenses and bookkeeping,
Hmm.
and it just seemed like there was this whole organizational part of it that most people didn't realize that it takes to fund and operate a terrorist group.
Well, yeah, and Chitra, one thing I want to bring out, I don't know if I brought up before now. So our division is the only law enforcement division that can investigate criminal tax crime. Um, we're the only ones that have the authority to investigate and refer our cases to the Justice Department, who then looks at them, says, yes, this is worthy of an indictment, and so on and so forth. No one else does that. So that is our mission. Our mission primarily is tax crime. And I would say, 70% of what we do is angled toward detecting that tax fraud. That's what we're charged with. And then we have another part of our expertise and program area that goes into money laundering, violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, and those last two really encompass so much criminal activity, right? I mean, if you're trying to hide something in someone else's name, or you're making money off, so if you're laundering your money, it's going to go to criminal activity. And so just to make it real clear, that's our responsibility. First of all, to identifying and investigating allegations of criminal tax fraud. Again, no mistakes. It's not a one-year mistake. These are people who have evaded their tax liability over a period of time with a lot of bad behavior, and usually hidden their money around the world. In today's tax cases and money laundering cases, they are no longer just domestic. They're not just held within the continental United States. Our casework is global, and you mentioned earlier that we have attaches around the world. That's a fancy title for a very skilled special agent who is stationed in a country, in an embassy, working with other law enforcement, that helps agents here in the States identify and secure evidence of crime, of this criminal activity that might be in another country. And our cases are almost always global in nature these days, because the internet's made the world a lot smaller. We both know that.
Yes, and almost virtually every crime has some touch point on the internet.
You got it. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because where before we would tend to look at paper transactions, paper receipts, paper invoices, maybe a company had a double set of books. It was always something you held in your hand. And as the internet blossomed and services came out of the internet, our work, naturally, business traverses the internet, value traverses the internet, whether it's a Bitcoin, whether it's a wire being sent somewhere. So when you asked earlier, how did it change? We changed and evolved in terms of following money, following value, like anyone else did doing business, right? We just learned how that money moves to pay for services. And in some cases, it's a service that's illegal.
And you played a role in looking at some of the COVID-19 recovery relief related fraud as well. What was that process like, and how much did you seize in terms of assets and funds?
Wow, yeah, we did. I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, when all the COVID relief money came out, it's not unlike a lot of relief programs that are geared towards getting money to taxpayers, people that, in this case, victims of COVID, whether you're an employee or an employer that can no longer be in business. So that money's directed to those folks, and there's always a criminal that's going to do their best to steal that money from the government. And we had plenty of that. So there's the loans that were given out during COVID. And there were a number of programs. Criminals file false paperwork saying, "Hey, I'm an employer. I had 50 employees. I had to lay them off. I need this amount of money." And of course, who has the information that knows? Of course, IRS has the information that can tell you, "Hey, is this a real business that had employees over the last 10 years?" And it isn't that simple, but just to give you a simple example, that application, often after the funds are paid, because that was not our responsibility to pay the funds. It was just to get it out to everyone that needed it. But on occasion, we would compare those applications with what we know be filing. And so if you have a brand new business that says they had 50 employees, well, if they never operated and they got loans, we're off to the races and looking at that kind of allegation, right? We don't know what's happening there yet, but we get out there pretty quick. And as a result, we had, I would say, over 100 indictments, millions of dollars that we were able to secure and seize back and bring back in the government. But that'll happen again. Whatever the next program's whatever the taxpayer is going to need for relief, decades from now or years from now, who knows what that is. But an effort for the government to deliver those funds to help victims, in this case of COVID, the criminal will always take advantage of it. That's what they do. That's their business. That's what they do all day long, and they're pretty darn good at it.
Yeah, public corruption is another area of focus. How has it evolved over the last few years?
Well, what I would tell you is that in addition to the investigation of the gangster activity and the mafia activity, during the course of all that, of course, there's what most people know is bribery and corruption that happens, and we follow the money. If the money takes us to a person who has the public's trust, in other words, elected official, is just another criminal to us. We don't attach a name or a title to the case. We just follow the evidence and what we think are the most significant matters. And in many cases, we have had a lot of public corruption cases. I've been involved in a couple while I was the agent in charge of the Chicago field office. Dennis Hastert, who was a former Speaker of the House, was put in jail for some bank violations that were related to some other activity behind the scenes. And we worked that case with the Bureau. So someone who very notable over the years, had a significant role in national politics for a while, went to jail. And there's been others like that as well. Again, we don't attach a name or title to the case. When the evidence points to bad things happening, or someone paying for some sort of illegal activity or violating the Bank Secrecy Acts by depositing small amounts of money over a period of time to avoid a filing requirement, we work with FinCEN and other agencies, to sort of root out what's meant by all those transactions.
And I would imagine, I don't know what you can say, if anything, about this, but we've read, obviously, there's been tons and tons of reporting about former President Donald Trump and all of the tax investigations swirling around him. And so if there were the criminal angle to that, that would obviously be handled by your division.
Well, yeah. And like you said, there's nothing I could or would say about anything like that. But any allegation that's brought on someone, regardless of their name, regardless of the title, we take it in, we vet it, we look quietly at it, right? Because sometimes these are just, in people who are just, the allegation doesn't really prove out. And so we're real careful, we have to be, that when we look at an allegation around tax evasion or some other criminal activity, that we take it at face value, but we look at it behind the scenes quietly to see, is there any authenticity to this? We have information sources at our fingertips to know what the reporting should be on their taxes, getting close to that. And so that in mind, we handle almost any kind of allegation that comes to us, but we also work smart. We have data at our fingertips now. Some of the things that have changed since the 90s and the early 2000s, we now have products that help us really massage our data inside IRS to make sure we can detect anomalies in filings, and be more efficient for the taxpayer to detect what we think might be possible civil audit activity, where maybe there's an error, and then maybe worse than that, there's a pattern of bad behavior that some algorithm that one of our real smart mathematicians has come up with that might spell out, hey, this algorithm applied to this data tells us that these tax returns are being filed compared to other things really look suspicious. So there's a lot of ways that we can do our best, right, to select the most egregious and the tax returns that have this highest probability of fraud.
We talked about the Lindbergh Baby kidnapping investigation and how the serial numbers were painstakingly jotted down hour after hour. And today, obviously, one of the biggest shifts for criminal investigation is the skyrocketing increase in cryptocurrency related crimes and crimes around digital assets. And it's a completely new framework for money, but also for all of the crimes that go with it. As you pointed out, where there's money, people are going to be committing all kinds of crime. This has been a huge sea change in your division as well, in trying to figure out how to go about doing this. On the one hand, you have the transparency of the blockchain, the auditability, but on the other hand, it's a whole new type of technology, having to explain it in court to juries, to judges, to prosecutors even. How are you making that transition?
No, it's a great question, Chitra, and I probably could have gotten into that earlier. We've made the transition. I'll tell you that we have one of the most highly skilled cyber units in law enforcement. And again, it isn't because we're smarter than another agency. It's just our skill sets are following money. In this case, following value, following Bitcoin. And so we've been involved in a number of cryptocurrency cases to where we know there's been illegal activity on the blockchain, purchases of narcotics, amongst many other things. In fact, the Silk Road investigation, while worked in a multi-agency environment, the Ross Albright was identified by an IRS special agent a couple of years after that task force was put together. And it's because of that special agent that he identified Ross Albright as being an original promoter of Silk Road. And that, along with some other breadcrumbs that had been developed in that task force, put law enforcement on Ross Albright, literally in a library, I want to say somewhere in San Francisco, where they found him and made sure they took his hands off the computer before they arrested him. That was our first case, Silk Road, and we were a big part of breaking that case. Of course, since then, there's been a lot of cryptocurrency cases. I don't know if that's the right description, but there's been a lot of investigations where cryptocurrency has been used for bad things. It's a great environment for great things to happen. That's my belief. But it's also an environment that's not well regulated. There's not a lot of know your customer, and the criminal organizations are and will take advantage of it. In fact, it was just a few years ago that we were involved in an investigation called Welcome to Video. And it's this case is sort of close to our hearts because you might not think of IRS Criminal Division, a financial agency, looking into a case where it involved the darknet purchase off a website of pornography involving, children. But that's exactly what it was. Welcome to Video is a business on the darknet that advertised child exploitation and videos, and we were a part of that. We helped identify where that darknet server was, and that held all that information around people transacting business, buying those videos, uploading those videos, and that's one of our talents. We follow value through the blockchain, and our agents, along with some really smart computer programmers, i.e. contractors that had been with us for 3-4 years, we sort of mixed and molded our skill sets together. And we have a really quite a brain trust of agent to contractor, computer contractor marriage there, if you might say it, that they can identify things that just aren't found by the law enforcement. So they found this darknet server in South Korea. They secured it. They looked at the IP addresses, and that resulted in more than 300 arrests around the world taken on that website.
What are some of the other cases around cryptocurrency and digital assets that you've been involved in that you can talk about?
Sure. Like I said, we started with the Silk Road, a number of cases since then, but the most recent one is Hydra. That was actually announced maybe, I think it was last week. Hydra is the largest known darknet marketplace, and it was estimated that 8% of all the darknet related cryptocurrency went through Hydra since 2015, total of around $5.2 billion in cryptocurrency. That was shut down, and it was actually a Russian operator indicted in that. So that sort of goes to sort of today's narrative, right, around sanctions and the movement of funds that go to maybe some sanctions conversation that we might have as well. A number of cases, I'll just list a couple of names. We were involved in BitConnect. I mentioned earlier, welcome to video, Bitfinex, and a number of other crypto cases as well. Three, though, that are probably, I think, draw some interest and people may not know about. Actually involved in taking down no less than three websites that were related to terrorist activity. In fact, those three websites ran by al-Qassam Brigade's campaign, and they on their social media page they were just soliciting donations to fund campaigns of terror, and that's really what they actually advertised it that way. Bitcoin donations, they said they were untraceable, and they'd just be used for violent acts and so on. Al-Qaeda campaign, they had a site, and they had a Bitcoin money laundering network. In some cases, they said they were a charity. Of course, as we trace those funds, we know they're not. And then finally, there was an ISIS campaign. Their website claimed, and this is really goes to something even more current, they were claiming to sell N95 respirator masks during COVID, right? So the funding, again, being asked to go to that site and eventually going to fund bad things. We were involved in a multi-agency effort to take those down. Again, that goes to our work with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
And what can you say about the recent Bitfinex hack, which was an incredibly fascinating story at many levels?
Yeah, I know that I wish I was the expert on that. I can tell you that we have others in the agency that are probably more well versed on this than I am. But I mean, I know that we arrested two people in Manhattan, and they were involved in a conspiracy to launder currency valued at more than $4.5 billion, and we've actually seized, and this was one of the largest seizures ever, $3.6 billion. Lead to that hack. So there's that hack, and then there's the seizure. And again, how do we identify where those funds are, right? I mean, especially since the hack was so long ago. And again, it's just following money, following value. And the way we found this sort of in short order, Chitra, is that we've been involved in so many internet-based investigations, cryptocurrency investigations, that as we get bits and pieces of each case, I guess there's just family criminal activity. There's these transactions that somehow have some connections. It's not all in a straight line, right? It's zigs and zags, I guess. And as the agents that work those cases, we have a small select group of agents. I say small, it's relative, but our agents collaborate real well together. They work real well with other agencies that do this work. And what they found over a 5 to 6 year period of time is that they drew all these clues from other investigations. They were able to put together where that hack, when it happened, where the money went, and the people now who have those wallets. Then, of course, you have to seize those wallets in a way that they're then secure. And our agents were able to do that. And it resulted in a seized cryptocurrency value in excess of $3 billion. That's a billion with a B.
That's incredible. The money it almost sounds like funny money, right? It's just everything's in the billions these days when it comes to these types of crimes. They're just massive in scale, and these criminals are incredibly ambitious and pretty creative in how they're trying to game the system and get away with literally billions of dollars.
Well, and I think what we found too, one thing that's common to all these investigations, Chitra, is that the sales, the purchase of virtually every kind of drug, narcotic, person, human trafficking. In one case, like I mentioned earlier, sexual videos of sex acts involving children. Criminals are criminals, but I'll tell you, when you're traversing and dealing in Bitcoin and maybe other value, first of all, it's not anonymous. You and I both know there's an open blockchain that we can see. But when they're traversing this amount of money and blindly buying and selling these drugs, and administering or hosting a server that does bad things, these are cases that we're looking at every day. If the criminal thinks that they're not transparent to us, that they can hide from us, I would just say they can go to our website and look at the much longer list of these cases than I can cite to you by memory today.
That's great. One real quick question about cryptocurrency and sort of this increasingly decentralized economy before we close with the look at the sanctions work that you're doing. But as the financial system becomes more and more distributed and diffused and decentralized, how are you going to be able to track these types of crimes and be able to bring those people to justice? I recently read this, just as an analogy. I was reading this story about the self-driving car getting pulled over for speeding and there's nobody there to ticket, right? That kind of conundrum, if you can apply that to the decentralized economy and decentralized financial system, how do you anticipate staying ahead of the game and being able to figure this out?
Well, Chitra, I don't know if we necessarily stay ahead of it. I would say we stay even with it. And like you reminded me at the beginning of this, how many decades I've been with CI. One of the things I know is true then, during my career, is true now. They may hide, but eventually people exit their money to buy things, houses, cars, things I probably can't repeat on here, right? That's if we don't catch them then, and that's usually when it happens because people brag, and they buy assets that they have no other legal means to purchase. That's when we catch them. We could talk about this value here, right, on the blockchain or hidden in a wallet somewhere. But what good is it to someone sitting there? Eventually, they're going to spend it, they're going to move it, and we learn about it. Crooks are, while they're greedy and they're power hungry, they're not loyal to each other. Two of them cannot keep a secret, and that's how we catch a case. We also have analytical power that we can look at certain cryptocurrency movement, and a good example might be where you and I, or maybe not, I go to the bank to deposit a check like it's across the street, but if our tools, our cryptocurrency tools, see that same kind of deposit from a person in one location, hitting 7 or 8 different exchanges, and then rounding a corner and going back to that bank on the street, it's a little suspicious. And that's sort of my way to, in crayon, right, to explain to you how we detect some of this. So we stay even and sometimes ahead, but at a worst case scenario, I believe we're even with the people that are learning to move things in a decentralized way.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the work you've been doing on sanctions and sanctions violations and klepto capture, this task force by the Justice Department.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking about that. So we are part of this task force at the Justice Department, which means the Justice Department sees a need here to just really centralize and galvanize and put together every agency that has a role in policing the world. And in our case, the value we bring is that for the last 2 decades, and I didn't mention this, Chitra, is that we 15 years ago, everyone was hiding, the people that were hiding money offshore, including some of these people that you might have heard about, the oligarchs and others like them, they were hiding their money in Swiss bank accounts. Well, we broke that Swiss bank account code 15 years ago. And a lot of those Swiss bankers, told us, okay, these are people who we've been hiding money for. We now know that we can't do that well. And here are our account holders. And so what value we bring is that we've been doing this offshore, identifying bad guys and bad conduct for decades. And so what we bring to the table is that this activity where we see probably maybe the arm of the oligarchs that are serving that effort there in Russia, we've seen those families, those organizations is really what they are. We've seen them in cases before. So what we bring to this is our skills of following that money, our history of knowing how the offshore bank accounts work, nominee names, how money can be moved and traversed, both electronically from one account to another. So we're part of the Kleptocracy task force, and between what we know and what the FBI knows, HSI and so on, we will figure out who is best situated to identify those assets, to identify that money, because in the end, what we're doing is we're targeting complex transnational criminal organizations. They just happen to be called oligarchs, but we've been doing that for a couple of decades now, and we'll continue to do that. And now we're just laser focused on a certain group of people that are both directly related to that war effort or indirectly related to that war effort. And we're part of that task force that's been organized by Justice.
And you always hear about these crazy seizures of various assets. And I guess in this case, those yachts are kind of fun to see.
Well, yeah, I have not seen any up close, but I'll tell you that a good example would be that where we might be asked for certain information that we may or may not know about an asset like that. We work legally, we know through our legal process with our international partners, which again are going back to the attaché, the special agent that sits in different countries. We have those relationships. They call us for help. We call them for help, and we are part of adding a piece to that puzzle where maybe that foreign country and their law enforcement might seize that asset, or we seize it here, or another law enforcement agency seizes it. But the fact is, we have to put our information together before we can really make it work, because there is a legal process. We just can't go out and grab it. We have to tie it to bad behavior, tie it to sanctions activity, and once those individuals, those companies, those facilitators of this bad behavior are put on Treasury's sanctions list, then those assets can be seized. And we're part of identifying those entities, those individuals, their connections to that war effort over there, and we're part of that, and we're helping fill that list of for sanctions, for purposes of attaching that sanctions brand, if you want to call it that, to those entities, those individuals.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Jim. We've covered like the sweeping arc of history of criminal investigation and all of the changes in technology and in the nature of crime, and how you are going after those who try to evade taxes and all of the crimes related to that. Do you have any closing thoughts when you kind of look at that sweeping arc on where this is going and where you've been?
Well, first of all, I'm lucky to have been here, work with I would say some of the most highly skilled, adaptive, smart people that you're going to come across, dedicated public servants. So I've enjoyed my entire time here and continue to enjoy it with CI. Where do I see things going? I see us continuing to operate. I will tell you that we haven't always had a lot of agents in our workforce, and we suffered some attrition over the last couple years to the point where we really lost some of our bandwidth. We have begun hiring again, and the agents that are coming in our ranks now are not unlike the legacy agents from decades ago. They're highly skilled, they're highly educated, they have good backgrounds, and they're committed to public service, because you don't get rich here. It's a government job, but it's very satisfying to know that you're doing something good. So I have all the confidence in the world that this division of IRS will continue to be a shining star for not just IRS, but for federal law enforcement. And I know will also continue to be sought out, like we are, by prosecutors who know the work we do is as foolproof as we can possibly get it with the evidence that we can secure. So that said, Chitra, thanks for talking to me. We have gone through a lot. There's little stories or larger stories in every facet of what we just talked about, and I hope I made some sense of this more than 100-year legacy that is IRS criminal investigation.
Thank you. James Robnett is the deputy chief of the IRS Criminal Investigation based in Washington, D.C. He is responsible for overseeing a worldwide staff of nearly 3,000 criminal investigation employees, including approximately 2,000 special agents located in 21 field offices and 11 foreign countries, who investigate crimes involving tax, money laundering, public corruption, cyber crimes, identity theft, narcotics, and terrorist financing. Robnett began his career as a special agent in 1994. He has moved through the leadership ranks and as a senior executive has held positions of increasing responsibility in Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. This is Techtopia. I'm Chitra Ragavan. Techtopia is a podcast from Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups with brand strategy, positioning, and narrative. Our producer is Jeremy Kaur, founder and CEO of Executive Podcasting Solutions, with production assistance from Kate Cruz. Our creative advisor is Adi Wineland, and our research and logistics lead is Sarah Muller. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars, leave a review, and do recommend it to your friends, family, and colleagues. For questions, comments, and transcripts, please visit our website at goodstory.io or send us an email at podcast@goodstory.io. Join us next week for another episode of Techtopia. I'll see you then.